Greetings, class, and today our topic is Imperialism and World War I. The topics that we will cover in this section include the expansion of European power in the new imperialism, and here we will speak about the definition of imperialism and the consequences of imperialism. The emergence of the German Empire, this will be touched upon briefly. World War I. I am afraid we are not going to delve into the Russian Revolution. We will speak about that in more detail at a later time. And then we will continue with the end of World War I. By way of introduction, let us remember that during the 19th century, European countries were very influential all over the world. They possess, as you can see here, unprecedented influence. This had started with the um, age of discovery with the Spanish and Portuguese, and then with the French and others, but especially with the Spanish and French, and colonization starting in the 15th century. But this unprecedented control brought about very serious problems all over the world. It brought about a terrible war that eventually brought about the downfall of many European countries. Here are some questions I'd like for you to think about. The first one is, why were Western powers eager to obtain colonies? Why is World War I a turning point in history? By the way, World War I is also known as the Great War. Prior to World War I, there had been many wars, but mainly between individual countries or states. But World War I was known as the Great War because it involved just about every country in Europe, the United States, and countries in the Far East. The next question I'd like for you to think about is, how did World War I alter the relationship between imperial powers and colonized people? In other words, how did World War I change the relationship between mainly European countries and other countries in Asia, Latin America, and Africa? Let us now turn our attention to the expansion of European power and what is known as the New Imperialism. By the way, it is called the New Imperialism mainly because it was a different approach to imperialism. It was a different approach to the way that European countries had dominated other countries. Let us look at the definition of what we mean by this. Now, we can look at this European expansion from different angles, from different perspectives. Let's keep in mind that in the 19th century there were vast European developments in the areas of science, technology, especially military weapons, transportation, also communication and agriculture. And this provided the foundation, the basis for dominance um, of the European countries over other parts of the world. The Europeans also had the feeling, they really believed that their civilization was superior to that of other peoples. And because they also had um, better military weaponry, they tended, not just tended, they in fact went about enforcing this feeling of superiority. Let us remember that in the late 19th century, the European countries control over one-fifth of the world's land and controlled one-tenth of the world's population. Of course, the areas that they controlled were mostly in Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia. Here is a map that briefly shows the areas of control, and these areas were mostly controlled by the British. Some were British colonies, some were British protectorates, and of course there were the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese. Uh, One notable exception was the Ottoman Empire that was still in existence at the time. What do we mean by new imperialism? Let us take a look at this definition. It is the policy of extending a nation's authority by territorial acquisition or by the establishment of economic and political hegemony over other nations. There are two aspects we want to keep in mind here. One is the acquisition or the taking over of territory of one nation by of a nation by others, and also establishing economic and political control over other nations. This is what really this is what really shows what the new imperialism was all about. I repeat, territory and economic and political control over other nations. Territorial, economic, and political control of one nation over another. Now, there is no agreement over the motives for new imperialism. The scholars do not really say or agree that there is any one reason. Some say it was simply a matter of greed. Others feel it was for different reasons, such as economic or cultural reasons. So we're going to take a look at these. From an economic perspective, or the economic interpretation of new imperialism, the scholars pointed out that the developed nations, pardon me, such as the European nations, needed their colonies to supply raw materials. Let us remember that many European nations were thriving because of the Industrial Revolution that had taken place earlier. So there were vast areas uh, in Europe that were very industrialized. And in order for industry to succeed, they needed raw materials. So where would they get these raw materials? From their colonies. They would get the raw materials, let's say from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, take it to Europe, manufacture these materials, have new products, and then sell these new products not only in Europe but also to their colonies. So they established new markets, and of course this was very financially profitable. But as we said earlier, there is no evidence according to some scholars, to support the theory that the European nations really needed the colonies, that it was a major necessity and like they would not exist, or that they had to occupy these areas in order to continue to exist. Another interpretation is the cultural, religious, and social interpretation of new imperialism. Here, the Europeans felt that they were justified because they were, in fact, an advanced and superior nation. So, as such, they had the obligation to bring their culture, their religion to the quote unquote less fortunate peoples of the world. For example, they felt that Christianity, since most people in Europe were Christians, that Christianity was in fact a superior religion and it was their duty to spread Christianity to other parts of the world. That is how we see they were very committed, mind you, missionaries going to Africa and Asia to spread their understanding of Christianity. This is quite debatable if what they were spreading was really the teachings of Jesus, peace be upon him, or their version of what they call Christianity. And in fact, you might notice that the indigenous peoples of the Americas today are mostly Catholic because that's a result of the Spanish, another European nation, who felt that it was their duty to spread the superior culture to the colonized peoples. Um, there were some, we could say, strategic and political considerations. Some things that took place, I would say, almost by accident, result of the new imperialism. One such case was the building of the Suez Canal in 1869 by the British. This was, in fact, an important feat of engineering, but at the same time, it brought along other issues, problems, because the British had to move, as they felt, into Sudan in order to protect their interests in Egypt. Another event that took place was the French moving into Algeria and occupying Algeria. They stayed there for actually until the 1960s, and that did not end very well. The French had also moved into Tunisia in order to keep the Italians out. And of course, um, there are other countries that claimed their protectorates or areas that they occupied, claiming that they were protecting them, and they used these as bargain chips later. Um, Here was an example of what is known as an irrational element of the new imperialism, because many powers simply decided that it was a free for all. So the French and the Spanish and the British moved into Africa, especially. This was known as the Scrambler for Africa, and basically just started occupying great areas, vast extents of the continent, and claimed it belonged to them. So that's why we ended up seeing that the French occupied the areas that we know today as parts of West Africa, such as the Ivory Coast, Mali, Senegal, the British, Niger for that matter, the British areas that are known today as East Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda. By the way, the French were also in Central Africa, Rwanda, Burundi. The Germans decided to occupy Southwest Africa, Namibia, and parts of Cameroon. And this was, in essence, what was known as a scramble for Africa. One interesting point to make here is that King Leopold of Belgium decided to occupy and claim all of what is known as the Belgian Congo, which is an area larger than many European countries together. He claimed this as his personal property, just as if someone claimed a portion of land. And there were some horrible events, very disturbing events that took place there, atrocities. Some of these were described in a book by Joseph Conrad called The Heart of Darkness. And here's a very disturbing picture of some of the atrocities that took place. In the Pacific, the new imperialism was manifested by the British um, in the Pacific, mainly in Japan and China, and also the Americans had a part in this. But the U.S. policy was known as the open door, and then the Monroe Doctrine. And there was the Spanish-American War, which took place between these the old guard, the Spanish, and the emerging nation, the U.S. And this really helped the United States move into an era of almost as an imperial power, but not in the same sense as the Europeans. By the way, by the end of the Spanish American War, the territories we know today as the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico were ceded from the Spanish to the Americans. And of course, the Americans occupied the Philippines as a possession until the middle of the 20th century. And Puerto Rico is still American territory. Cuba is no longer, except for the area of Guantanamo. And this, as we said, was just one of the results of the new imperialism in the Pacific. Here's a map that shows areas of involvement of the United States. Um, Let us move along here. And very briefly, you might want to take a look at the major events, the chronology of major events that took place in the new imperialism. Please feel free to pause at this point to go over this section. We're going to continue because this recording is in place of one of the classes that we missed, so I do expect you to go through this over and over and take your time to understand the concepts that are being covered here. Now, I'd also like to bring something to your attention, is that it's not just a matter of memorizing these facts or dates, events, but to understand how these events have the role that these events play in our lives even today, the lives of your community, your country, and even your personal lives. So let us move along here and speak about the emergence of the German Empire. As we said, this is not going to be an area that we will just go over this very quickly because it's a very wide subject. The chancellor, or the ruler we should say, the Kaiser, I think he was referred to, Otto von Bismarck, was a very dominant figure in European politics. And he had entered a series of alliances, mainly with Germany, pardon me, with Austria. This was in effect, an attempt to establish German domination over different parts of Europe. Here is just a picture of two of the leading figures in that situation. Now, there were many areas that were under the control of the the Ottoman Empire, and there was a rivalry between, of course, the Ottomans, and also there was the Russians were also a dominant force, and the Germans again trying to establish their domination in that part of the world. So they entered into various treaties and various agreements in order to maintain a balance and decide who is going to control what parts of the that part of the, the continent. Now, I should have mentioned before we speak about World War One that the area we know today as the Balkans, Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, Serbia, Montenegro, uh, uh, Bosnia-Herzegovina, played a very important role in this uh, during this in this period of history. So, what about World War One? See, as we mentioned, there were many events taking place, and um, there were different forces at work here. Now, the Ottoman Empire had begun to weaken. One of the reasons was that the Europeans had superior military power, and also there were internal problems within the Ottoman Empire itself, and it had really been it had extended itself. It was very vast, and to a certain extent, uh, administering it, the administration of the empire had become very difficult. At the same time, the Russians, who were looking for a way to establish control, supported Slavic states such as Serbia, because they were akin to them, and we see that even today that there is a good relationship between Slavic people of Yugoslavia, and the Russians felt that they were responsible for their well-being. And at the same time, there are other independent states such as Greece and Romania. But all of these events were taking place, and they were very quick shifting lines, geographical lines. Um, there were a group of people in the Ottoman Empire known as the Young Turks who felt that the Turkish or the Ottoman Empire had lost its way and it was not as powerful as it used to be. And they wanted to revive the Ottoman Empire and bring back its old glory. They tried in 1908 to overthrow the Ottomans. At the same time, there were different events taking place, as we can see here. The one that was known as the Bosnian Crisis, and there was also the Austrians. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but it's enough for you to understand that there were so many forces fighting and competing with each other, mainly the Russians, who wanted the support of the Slavic people. Then there were the Germans and the Austrians together, and at the other side the there was the Ottoman Empire, and they also had their support from the predominantly Muslim peoples in the Balkans. Let's say, for example, in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Um, Let us see what happened and what caused the start of World War One. Well, first of all, there were several wars, as you can see here. The Balkan War, the first Balkan War in 1912, and a second one. But these were mainly uprisings, not full-blown World War One. That came later. As we said earlier, you might see here the different areas, shifting lines of the shifting lines of the geographical lines during the early part of the 20th century. Now, the event that is often cited as the start of World War One is this one, which is the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, which took place in June 1914. He was the Archduke of Austria, and he was killed by a Bosnian nationalist. This person was a member of a group called the Black Hand, and because the Germans had um, uh, had this, vowed to support the Austrians, when this event took place, it precipitated a series of retaliations. You know, the 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 killing of Archduke Ferdinand brought about first the Germans coming to the aid of the Austrians, and then the Russians um, getting involved. And before we knew it, the there was the beginning of World War One. Here's a picture of Archduke Ferdinand, who was assassinated, and another picture showing the events that took place. But of course, this event, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, was just the trigger, because there's always something that triggers a major war. So there were so many things, so many events that had developed before that, but this was the trigger that started the war. So, as you can see, we're speaking here about the outbreak of the war. By the way, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand took place in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Bosnia, specifically in the city of Sarajevo. And here is, we're going to stop here, and here is the chronology of events that took place that led up to the start of World War One. We're going to bring this to a close here, and this is the first part of the lecture um, that we did not have on the I don't remember the exact date. So thank you for listening, and we will continue with the second part. um, I will post that shortly. Thank you.